Hello and welcome to the Care It Out Sleep Show, a podcast for tired parents who are searching for a bit more sleep the caring way. I'm your host, Kerry Secker, infant sleep consultant, founder of my unique sleep approach, Care It Out, and your caring sleep supporter. I really hope you'll join me on my mission to get Smalls a settled night's sleep without the tears, training or techniques. I love talking about sleep and I can't wait to share my sleep subjects with you. My approach to getting you more sleep is simple, straightforward, but above all, it's got to make sense and feel best for you. Ready to get more sleep? Then let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Care It Out Sleep Show. You are listening to your host, Kerry Secker, infant sleep consultant, founder of my unique sleep approach, Care It Out, and on a mission to get you and your small a settled night's sleep without tears or training. Big welcome to episode 20 of the Sleep Show. I honestly can't believe we're at episode 20 already. And whether you are a seasoned listener of the podcast, a sleep stalker as you like to call yourselves, or you've just discovered this podcast for the first time, big welcome. And I really hope, as always, that you find this episode reassuring, informative and reassuring, because that's always my intention and that's all I ever want for these little podcasts. So on with the show. Episode 20, Bedtime Boundaries Q&A. So I thought for this show, I'm going to try something a little bit different. And I'm going to have a Q&A session. And the Q&A session is going to be all about bedtime boundaries. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split the show into two parts. First part is I'm going to go through what a bedtime boundary is, go through the bedtime boundary basics. And then once I've gone through that, the second part of the show, I am going to answer some of the questions you sent in. So a while ago, I can't remember if it was the end of last week or the beginning of this week, I put out on my Facebook and Instagram, I just said I'm doing a Q&A session for the next podcast. Do you have any questions on bedtime boundaries or how your small goes to sleep? And I got sent loads, as you can imagine. So I'm going to try and do my best. I can't answer them all, because I honestly got sent hundreds, but I'm going to do my best to answer a good 6 or 7 and dig into them a little bit deeper. And I really, really hope that helps you and your small settle to sleep at bedtime a little bit better. So let's start with what a bedtime boundary is. So you might have heard a bedtime boundary being called lots of different things, but the most common ones are sleep prop, negative sleep association, crutch. I don't know what it is about the word crutch. I really dislike that word. I don't know what it is about that word. Maybe it's because it rhymes with crotch, but I really dislike that word. And I really am on a mission to move the shame around sleep, because I think there's so much of it. So I don't call bedtime boundaries how your small goes to sleep, any of those things. And on my approach, there's no right or wrong bedtime boundary. It's simply what is working for you and what works for your small as well. So some common examples of bedtime boundaries. These are the most common ones, but I've definitely seen some variations of them over the year, often really funny ones. We all do things really differently, but the most common examples of bedtime boundaries that I see in practice are feeding to sleep, whether that's the breast or the bottle, bouncing to sleep, rocking to sleep, cuddling to sleep, sitting with your little one whilst they're going to sleep. I think they're the most common ones, but there are some variations of them. But a bedtime boundary is simply what you do or what your small needs to get to sleep. That's a bedtime boundary. And as I mentioned before, there really is no right or wrong on my approach. It is just what works. For me, it will always come back to that. And for some smalls, probably the majority, I don't add it all up, but for the majority of smalls and families I speak to, they are fed, bounced, fed to sleep. You could swing them around your head and plop them in the cot from another room. I wouldn't suggest you do that, by the way, but you could do that. And at night time, they're either sleeping through. Yep, I've seen hundreds of babies, infants, smalls, toddlers, smalls, that's why I call them small, feed, bounce, cuddle, sit with them while they go to sleep at bedtime, and they do sleep through. They stitch every single sleep cycle, or they're waking up for the feeds that they genuinely need at night time, or they're at what I call their biological best. And that's brilliant. Bedtime boundary, if it's not an issue for you, it's not an issue for your small, it's working, we don't need to change it. However, for some smalls, and it's definitely not all, I don't buy into this one size fits all small, but for some, how they go to sleep, it blocks the stitching of the sleep cycles, and I call this the bedtime boundary block. And this is because nobody technically sleeps through the night. It is one of the worst sleep slogans ever. We are really vulnerable when we're sleeping. We need to sleep because we need to shut down completely, rest, restore, replenish, download our memories, consolidate our learnings. There's so much to sleep, but when we do that, we are really vulnerable. We have no idea what's going on in our bodies. We have no idea what's going on in our environment. So to make sure that we're keeping ourselves, we wake up numerous times during the night and do what I call change checks and check in with ourselves. We do this as adults. Everybody does this from 4 months old. We don't really remember doing it. It's quite an innate process. You might notice it. I tend to notice I do it more. I definitely notice it more if I've had a couple of glasses of wine in the evening. And I sometimes notice it more in the early hours of the morning as well, from 3 a.m. onwards, when our melatonin levels, our sleep hormones, start to decrease. But we all do it and we don't even notice we're doing it. And for some little ones, what can happen is they're fed, rocked, bounced, cuddled to sleep at bedtime. Then when they wake up, they check in with themselves, they do their change checks, they realise that there's a change from how they went to bed, i.e. they're not on the parent's not there, and they're not feeding, they're not being rocked, there's no motion. That can mean a compromise to their safety, which I know sounds really super drastic, doesn't it? But that's all we're doing in life, is surviving, especially at night, let alone in life, but at night time. And they'll notice it very quickly, and then they'll need whatever they had at bedtime to tell their bodies that it's safe enough to go back to sleep. As I mentioned before, for some smalls, it doesn't have an impact at all, no matter what time of the night. For some, you might find the first part of the night is a little bit more settled. They might wake up, but if they do, they wake up and quick feed, quick rock, quick pat, quick resettle, and they're back down. This is because the melatonin levels are at the highest at the beginning of the night. But as the night goes on, especially past midnight, magic midnight, when the melatonin levels, sleep hormones, start to decrease, what can happen then is that the bedtime boundary they might need more of it. They might wait more frequently for it. They may need more of it, or it might stop working altogether, and that's when you can get into a position. And that's the time of night where you might find yourself having to feed, rock, cuddle them constantly to actually keep them asleep. So I hope that makes sense. I'm really passionate about sleep making sense to you, because I can't do anything unless I must be a very annoying person, unless I understand the reason why. And I really hope that gives you some insight into what's going on with your small when they're waking at night time. So as a sleep summary then for bedtime boundaries is simply how your small goes to sleep at bedtime, or what they need to get to sleep. I honestly don't believe in sleep props, negative sleep association, crutches. It is just, there's no right or wrong. It's just what works for you and what is working for your small and their sleep. For some, the majority of smalls I speak with or I talk to parents, the bedtime boundary doesn't block the stitching of the sleep cycles, and they either sleep through or wake up for the feeds that they need. But for some smalls, not all, the bedtime boundaries can block the stitching of the sleep cycles at night time. Because it comes back to, there's a difference when they wake up and do their change checks, there's a difference, and they need that to whatever happened at bedtime to tell their body that it's okay to go back to sleep. It's a real individual thing. Every small is different, and I take every family, every small at face value and where they are at. So when to change a bedtime boundary? Bedtime boundaries is it is the last thing I look at. I have 4 sleep steps. I originally called my 4 sleep steps for Saturday night sleep. These are naps and bedtime, so timings, I look at those first. Bedtime routine, aka preparation for sleep separation, and then what's actually happening at night time, supporting them to stitch their sleep cycles together at night time, and then bedtime boundaries is the last thing. And the reason why I look at them last is because it is very rare. It's more likely to be other things than the bedtime boundary, and putting all your other sleep steps in place often for many families means that you don't need to change the bedtime boundaries. And also, bedtime boundaries really is only an issue unless it's an issue for you or your little one, i.e. it comes back to if it's working for you, all is well. So the only time I really suggest changing a bedtime boundary is if it's not working for you. it's not working for your small, or you want to change it. I'm a massive fan in doing it. Will always come back down to, is it working for you? And if it's working for you, all is well. But if it isn't working for you, your family, your small, your home, your life logistics, then 9 times out of 10 we can make changes with care. So if you're happy, it's working for you, all is well, and you're happy rocking, holding, bouncing, feeding to sleep, please don't feel pressure that you need or must need to change this. And there's honestly no need to change a single thing. And my only sleep suggestions, really, if you are happy to, if you're happy with your bedtime boundary and it's working for you, is to keep it up. It only needs changing when you want to change it, or it's not working for your small. Try to keep it as simple as possible. Like if they're fed rock to sleep, it's absolutely fine to do that. It's not a bad habit, rod for your own back, but I would try and keep it as simple as possible. Stick to 1 or 2 things if you can. Ideally 1, but 1 or 2 things. And if you can, I would try to transfer them to the cot or their bed or their crib, or ninja roll away as soon as they're asleep. On my approach, it's not about getting them to fall asleep independently unless we need to. It's absolutely okay to have them on you and to stay with them until they're all the way asleep, but sometimes transferring them straight away or ninja rolling away can help them stitch their sleep cycles at night time. If you would like to change their bedtime boundary, I honestly believe that changes can be made with care, and you don't need to do again, I have always prefaced this with, I'm not anti anything. It's control crying out is not my bed bag, mainly because from my experience I've never had to do it with the children that I looked after, and it's very rare that it's needed to do. There's other things that we can try first, but it doesn't mean that I'm completely against it. But if you would like to get to the point where you would like to change their bedtime boundary and you don't want to do that, doesn't feel right for you, because if it doesn't feel right, chances are it's not the best thing for you and your family, because your guts don't fib. Your gut is good, feelings don't fib. I do believe that you can make changes with care if you want to. And my suggestion would be to try to get to a point where your bedtime boundary is as simple as possible. And my biggest tip is to try, and I always encourage parents to lose that expectation that you're going to go from where you are now to where you would like to be in one fell swoop. So for example, an example of this is I work with a lot of parents that do want to stop feeding, for not because I think it's a bad habit or rod for their own back, because they want to, and then I'm would always support them, and they, for whatever reason, they want to stop or get them to sleep in their cot. I always encourage them to let go of that expectation that we are just going to be able to go from feeding on you or falling asleep on you to in the cot and walking out the door and then being able to fall asleep really quickly or without any support, because I'll be honest with you, that is a little bit unrealistic. And this is because it's a massive change for them, and it's the same for us. We can't just get in a car and drive a car. We have to learn how to do it. You don't go out and just climb Everest without doing any steps in between. So my biggest tip here, or my biggest sleep suggestion, is to try and lose that expectation that you're going to go from where you are now to where you want to be in one swoop. My whole approach is that we step it down into more manageable steps, and that tends to make it more manageable, more sustainable, more comfortable for both parents, for both you and your small. The other one is consistency is often key. I talk about consistency all the time. You must be bored of me saying consistency, but it is quite important, because doing the same thing over and over again, it's really boring, that repetition, but doing the same thing over and over again, your small comes to realise very quickly what's happening. They know what's happening, they can expect it, they can anticipate it, and that makes them feel safe and secure. So consistency is often the key when changing a bedtime boundary. Doing one thing at a time, step it down a bit and do it for a period of time. Again, I call it Amazon Prime patience, and I do this all the time. If something hasn't happened quick enough, my Insta browser isn't working quick enough, or I can't think quick enough, I get really annoyed and I'm just like, why is this not working? And then I have to remind myself that we are so conditioned to want everything really quickly now, Amazon Prime patience, that some things do just take a little bit of time. The Other thing when we're changing bedtime boundaries is we have to embrace and let go of that expectation again. They are going to get overtired when we try something, and you are going to worry that they're getting overtired. This is completely normal and natural, because any change we make to bedtime boundaries, change is strange and they go on high alert. And that means it's completely normal for them to take a little bit longer to settle to sleep at bedtime. So I hear this all the time from families in practice. They are really worried that they're going to get overtired, and I encourage us to embrace this. If we know that we want to change bedtime boundaries or it's impacting sleep, they are going to get overtired in the short term. But usually what tends to happen, 3 or 4 days, and babies are very smalls are very adaptable, and they usually catch up with themselves, and that overtiredness is usually very short term. You are going to worry about them getting overtired. This is completely natural. I probably don't help talking about overtiredness all the time, but that's something to think about. And then the other one is, it takes time to expect that it's going to take a little bit of time. Again, Amazon Prime patients, we're not just going to stop feeding or stop rocking and they get to sleep straight away. It is going to take time for them to get the hang of doing something new. And again, that driving analogy, I love an analogy, where it took me 5 times to pass my driving test. Can anybody beat that? But it's the same for us. We don't just do a new skill, get in a car and we're able to drive. It takes time for that to feel comfortable and for us to feel consistent with it. And then if you're looking for some tools to actually move away from feeding, whether that's breast or bottle, cuddling, rocking, or sitting with them, I get asked this a lot. So I've listened to you guys, and I've got a bedtime basics, bedtime boundaries e-course, and this goes through I share with you all the tools that I use in my private practice with families. It's in a really short, concise e-course for you. It's $29.99, and what I do is I'll put the link in the bio. But that is, if you're looking to change your bedtime boundaries, that is where and I would signpost you to. All my tools are in that. Right, on with the Q&A. I'm excited. I've got my little piece of paper here. I've got my cup of tea. So what I'm going to do now is, I hope you found that really useful, a bit of an insight. If you haven't heard me talk about bedtime boundaries before, that's a really good introduction, I think. Really good sleep summary of the bedtime boundary basics. And what I'm going to do now is answer some of your questions on bedtime boundaries. I can't remember how many I've got. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I think I've got 8 or 9 questions. It might be a little bit more than I said, but we'll see how we get on. So question number 1, does how they go to sleep impact frequent waking? So as I mentioned before, that yes, for some it can impact their stitching of the sleep cycles at night time, but not all smalls will do that. And I don't believe that there is this one size fits all small, baby, child, toddler, and I don't believe there's this one size fits all perfect sleep scenario that we're all heading for. So at night time, I will always ask that question: how is it feeling to you? How is it feeling to the parents? And to answer this question, I think I already answered it before, but for some smalls, let's start again. For the majority of smalls, how they go to sleep, they're rocked, bounced, fed, cuddled, sung to, singing Wannabe at the top of your voice. They go into their cot or into their bed and they either stay asleep, they don't wake up, they don't need anything overnight time, or they're at their biological best where they are waking up for the feeds they need. So that how they go to sleep isn't impacting the frequent wake up. However, for some, and I definitely see some in practice, how they go to sleep can impact the frequent waking. And when it comes to frequent waking, I'm not going to stop sharing that message, because I think it's so super important that it is natural and normal for smalls to wake up at night time and have needs and feeds, but there's balance within that. And if it's unsustainable, not working for you, it's having an impact on everything on your family life, you want to change it for whatever reason, that's the reason. That's the only time that I would change it. So it really does depend on the small. Yes, sometimes it doesn't impact frequent waking, sometimes it does, for some smalls, changing the bedtime boundaries, that is the missing piece to getting to a settled night's sleep. It's usually with older ones from 6 months plus that it makes a difference. And I will always check that first before working with a family as well. I think that's really important. So, question number 2. Can I change the bedtime boundary if my small is bed begging? So bed begging is something that you might have heard me talk about, but bed begging is just when your small is really unsettled in the run up to bedtime. They might be unsettled having their dinner, rubbing their eyes, trying to fall asleep in their dinner. That's quite common. They might be quite tearful getting into the bath, coming out of the bath. They might be having a bit of pyjama drama on the other side of the bath where you're getting them into their pyjamas and they're crying and upset. Basically, bed begging is when they're a little bit overtired and they could do with bedtime a little bit earlier. Yes, you can change the bedtime boundary if your small is bed begging. And again, sometimes that really is the key to nudge families forward with that. But my suggestions would be to make sure that they are, and you can't always get, for some families, this is really important, for some families you can't always get to the point where they're not bed begging or that their naps are nailed, because for some it is the bedtime boundary bit that's the missing piece that pulls everything together, because everything's linked for your small. Diet, going to the toilet, digestion, did I just say going to the toilet? Going to the toilet, sleep behaviour. And it's the same with sleep. Everything's linked. So naps, nights, first nap, second nap, cat nap, bedtime routine, bedtime boundary. That's why I look at absolutely everything, because it's all linked. And for some little ones, we can't get to that point where they're not overtired before changing the bedtime boundaries. But if we don't change the bedtime boundaries, it's not moving them forward. It's rare, but that does happen. I'm trying to be really honest with you. But yes, you can change the bedtime boundary if your small is bed begging. But I would suggest making sure that you've got the naps as best as you can. You might not get the naps nailed, but just making sure that they're that they're naps, that they've got naps. I feel like I'm really waffling here. Just check the naps, they are going the best they can. And if you'd like some guidance on naps and nap gaps, I've got a free video which I will put in the show notes for this. The other one is if they're really bed begging, you might need to shorten down and speed up the bedtime routine. So yeah, 20-30 minutes is a really decent time for a bedtime routine, but if they're tired, the priority really is getting them down to bed ASAP. So you can leave out the bath or shorten the bath, give them a wash, leave out the bath. I promise you that's not why they're waking up in the middle of the night going, where's my bath? Feel free to leave out a story or a really super long wind down. Just speed up and clock through the bedtime routine a little bit more. And then the other one that could really help if your little one is really bed begging would be to try and bring the bedtime settling a lot earlier and seeing if that helps. That's what I would usually do. And it's very, very common in practice that I will see lots that smalls are already tired at bedtime. My suggestion would be to go really super slowly. That's why I do the whole tiny tweaks over time, because chances are small is already overtired at bedtime. If we make too big a change for them, it's just going to take them much longer. They get overtired. So really, that's really why I do that whole tiny tweaks over time approach, because that can help massively. Number 3 is if bedtime boundary... I see what you mean. Okay, question number 3 is if bedtime boundary is feeding to sleep, how would this impact the night feeds? So my whole approach, I like to think, again, being very honest, it's breastfeeding friendly. I wouldn't want to stop you ever feeding to sleep at bedtime if you didn't want to. I wouldn't want you to night wean or do anything that you didn't feel comfortable or happy doing. I'm going to be honest, because I always am. I don't know how changing the bedtime boundary is going to impact the nights. But what I can say for sure, because I see this all the time in practice, is that if your small needs a feed at night time and so basically if you change the bedtime boundary at bedtime, if your small really, really needs that feed at night time, it's not going to stop them calling out and requesting that feed. And we're always going to give it to them as well if they need it. So to answer your question, if the bedtime boundary is feeding to sleep, it can impact the night feed sometimes just by moving the boob up the bedtime routine or the bottle, or just, it's not about stopping completely, but getting a break between it. That actually can have a massive impact on the night. it's rare this happens, but I have done it in practice before, where we've moved up a little bit and little one is night weaned completely by themselves. We haven't pushed them, but at night time, if they need a feed, if they're genuinely hungry, they want a feed, they need a feed, changing the bedtime boundaries is so very unlikely to change that. They'll ask for it and we can always give it to them. So I hope that helps. Question number 4, I'm getting lost with the questions, is what is the best way to get your small drowsy but awake? This is a common question. Drowsy but awake. I very rarely say that word or that sentence, so I've just said it twice in the last sentence there. Because it is rarer than rocking horse poo, getting your baby drowsy but awake, and it can be very difficult to get that balance. They're either wide awake or they are asleep, especially for really super young babies, like babies under 4 months. It's very rare that you would get that drowsy but awake. However, all smalls are different. You might notice that your small does do that. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. There's anything wrong with your small if you see that. But my whole approach, it isn't about getting them drowsy but awake, because I just don't think that happens. You can move away from a bedtime boundary and support them to do a little bit more of the work. But when we're doing it, it's not about getting them to that elusive state, because sometimes, one, it very rarely exists, and actually getting them to that point can actually be more frustrating than actually taking the time. Because my approach is to, if we're going to work on bedtime boundaries, is to take that time and support them to fall asleep from awake if we're going to do it, or we very gradually wean off what they need, doing away with that drowsy and awake. So my answer to that is, what is the best way to get to drowsy awake? I think a really fair answer is, if your small naturally does it, that's fine. But if they don't, I would again encourage you to lose that expectation of trying to get to that point, because it's incredibly difficult. Question. I'm lost with the question, so I'm just going to go next question. I didn't number them. Do you think breastfeeding to sleep means more wake ups at night time? I think this is the same as how they get to sleep does it impact frequent waking? I think it's really important. Boobing to bed, the boobs are never to blame. Yeah, I think it's really important that the boobs are never to blame. They're not a bad habit, and if boobing to sleep at bedtime is working for you, it's working for your small. There's absolutely no need to change that at all. But to answer your question is, do you think breastfeeding to sleep means more wake-ups at night time? I think it comes back to, there's no one size fits all small. So for the majority, no, that doesn't. Working on moving, stopping feeding to sleep doesn't necessarily help with the wake-ups at night time, because it's natural that babies, smalls, have needs and feeds at night time. But if it's super frequent waking, or for in some cases, yes, sometimes that is the missing piece. It's not that the boobs are that feeding sleep is to blame, or a bad habit or anything like that. But sometimes breastfeeding can cause a bit of a bedtime boundary block. But again, would only change if a parent wanted to. Next question. Is it okay to have a different boundary with different parents? Absolutely, I think this is okay. Baby, it seems really logical, doesn't it? If they have one thing with you, then that's what they need for another person. But different, it's crazy. I think it comes back to, babies are very adaptable, and it's very common that they will have a different boundary. They'll fall asleep. For a great example, breastfeeding to sleep with mum, but then dad will rock, cuddle them, or maybe even get them to sleep by themselves. They're all really different, and it's absolutely fine if it comes back to, if it's working for you, all as well. And again, if the only time I would change that, or change and I think the thing to remember, actually, that this is a really good point, is that nobody does anything exactly the same way anyway. So it is natural that there's going to be some natural variation in how you put your smalls to bed with your partner. But yeah, I would only change that if it wasn't working for you, or we felt that it was impacting the sleep. But I think that's very unlikely. So yeah, completely normal, completely natural to have different boundaries with different parents, and if it's working for you, all as well. Next question. When changing a bedtime boundary, is it normal for sleep to get worse before it gets better? Yes, absolutely yes. In not all cases, so I would probably say for probably the majority, yes, it might take them longer to get to sleep at bedtime, and they might need a little bit more support while we're doing that. But the change to the nighttime, it doesn't get worse before it gets better. We see an improvement straight away. However, again, all families, all smalls are completely different. And for some, when we're changing a bedtime boundary, the sleep can get a little bit worse before it gets better. But it is usually short term. And I think the way to tell is if it starts off taking a long time and your little one looks tired when you're doing it, and it's taking longer and longer and longer, and you've been going for 4 or 5 days, chances are there might be a tweak that needs looking at bedtime. And I won't know what that tweak is until I've spoken to you or had a look at your little one's sleep story. It's impossible to say what's going on. But yeah, for the majority of smalls, working on bedtime boundaries, especially, I don't know what it's like if you're using the e-course, but definitely from the parents that I see in practice, because I would only change a bedtime boundary or suggest, I'd never tell a parent what they should or shouldn't be doing, suggest changing the bedtime boundaries. If I'm 99% sure that's why they're up at night time, chances are we see improvements to the nighttime, not straight away, but it gets quicker and easier every night, and there's some upward trajectory of improvement. However, for some, changing the bedtime boundary, it can get worse before it gets better. And I'm always really honest. I don't have nothing in life is 100% guarantee, and I'm always really honest about that. There's no guarantee that if you do this and this and this is what's going to happen, because too many variables. Every family is different, every small is different, every sleep story is different. The most common reason why sleep is getting worse before they get better is that your little one is getting more and more overtired, and it comes back to what I was talking about before. When we're making a change is strange. It feels unfamiliar. It's going to take much longer for your small to settle to sleep at bedtime. That's completely normal. But for some, because it takes longer, it means they're even more overtired. So sometimes bringing bedtime slightly earlier, I wouldn't go crazy, 10-15 minutes, that can often be a key to getting moving you forward with that, if that's what's happening. And then the other one, the reason why it gets worse at night time, is sometimes when we're moving away from a bedtime boundary, smalls can get temporarily sleep stuck at night time. So we're moving away from the bedtime boundary at bedtime, but then at night time when they wake up, they can't quite get themselves back to sleep. They don't know how to get themselves back to sleep just yet, and that can happen as well. But it all does tend to settle down quite smoothly on its own, given just a little bit more time. So to answer your question, when changing a bedtime boundary, is it normal for sleep to get worse before it gets better? Yes, absolutely, in some cases. Check they're not overtired first. Bringing bedtime, just settling them a little bit earlier can mean that they're settling a little bit quicker and they're not so overtired when they go down. But if you are going with it and it's been 4, 5, 6 days, and actually 4, 5, 6 days, you have to really gauge it. You're always in charge and in control of my approach. So if you instinctively feel it's not working, then I would park it, and perhaps get in touch with me, share your sleep story, or have if a call is an option, that's always an option. But I think if you are, there's a pattern to it. It's just getting worse and worse and worse each night, and it's been going on longer for 7 days, then I would definitely park it. But yeah, any change there's going to be a period of adjustment. Sometimes there's a little bit of resistance, but care it out. It's usually comfortable. It feels comfortable to parents and smalls as well. And then this is the last question. How do I transition from feeding to sleep and not substitute it with something else, i.e. rocking? This is a brilliant question. They've all been great questions, by the way. I'm always so fair. They're all great questions, but this is brilliant because this is really at the crux of the care it out approach, and it's inevitable. And it comes back, I can't remember when I mentioned it in the show, but my whole approach is always to encourage parents to let go of the expectation that you're going to go from feeding to sleep or rocking to sleep to them plopping them in their cot, saying goodnight, patting them on the head, as some families that I'm working with say, pat them on the head, walk out of the room, and they're going to be able to get to sleep or know how to get to sleep really super quickly. Because it's such a big change, especially feeding to sleep. It is a biggie bedtime boundary doing that, and it is going to take time. So it seems very logical that to move away from, like to step it down might mean that you are moving from rocking to sleep. Instead of breastfeeding, you're moving to rocking to sleep or holding to sleep. It really, logically, it feels like you are kind of swapping one bedtime boundary for the other. And in a way, 100% you are. But from my experience, sometimes just moving the boob up the bedtime routine and moving to rocking, that's the key for some families to unblocking the sleep cycles at night time. And for some, if it doesn't, we're in a position then to maybe start supporting them to fall asleep in their cot. And we can't do that whilst they're still feeding to sleep, because it's impossible. Trying to put a baby down that's fed to sleep, especially breastfed to sleep in the cot, it usually ends up in cot carnage because they don't know how to get to sleep without the breast. It's too big a change. So to answer your question, how do I transition from feeding to sleep and not substituting it with something else? My approach is it's okay to substitute it with something else, because my whole approach is we sleep step it down, tiny tweaks over time, move away from feeding to rocking first of all, then rocking to holding, and then getting them into their cot. And yep, it does take a little bit of time, but most assumption is often the mother of all mess up, so I don't want to make a massive assumption here, but most families that are either listening to this or working with me or interested in any of my courses or listening to me on Instagram, they want an alternative to leaving their little one to cry. And the trade-off is taking some time. The trade-off of reducing the tears and making it manageable and comfortable for everybody, and so they don't get overtired, is that it can take a little bit of time. And it does mean stepping it down. And logically, I think it's because there's so much out there that everything is just a bad habit, a rod for your own back, or a bedtime boundary. And it's so natural to feel overwhelmed and go, oh my goodness, how am I going to go from here to there? Or how is this ever going to end? But I can only talk from my practice and experience, of course, but from my experience, that is the key, is gently move through those steps and gradually change their bedtime boundary over time. So I really hope you found that useful. That's all the questions. I tried to answer a broad range of questions there. I really hope you enjoyed the roundup of the bedtime basics and you enjoyed me going through those questions. If you are interested in you're listening to this and you instinctively feel it could be your bedtime boundaries that's the missing piece for your small. As I mentioned before at the beginning of the show, I've got a bedtime boundaries e-course, and it's really it goes through what is a bedtime boundary, but more importantly, it goes through all the tools that I share in practice. It breaks it down into manageable steps for you to help make changes to your small's bedtime boundaries the caring way. Hope you all really enjoyed this show, and I look forward to hearing you in the next episode. Thank you so much for listening to me, your host, Kerry Secker, on the Care It Out Sleep Show. I really hope you found the podcast reassuring, informative, and a little bit fun. If you did, please don't forget to subscribe to the show below, and I'd be so grateful if you could leave me some fabulous feedback. I always love hearing from you, and one lucky listener will win lifetime access to my Bedtime Basics e-course every single month. My next podcast episode will be out in 2 weeks' time, but if you can't wait for more of my sleep shizzle, you can find me over on Instagram at Care It Out Sleep Consultant. I update my sleep squares and speak sleep there on the daily. Big love and sleep solidarity to you all.